The 89 seconds. There's a clock in Chicago. It's not a normal clock. It doesn't tell you the time of day. It tells you something much more important. It tells you how close humanity is to destroying itself. Right now, that clock reads 89 seconds to midnight. That's the closest it's ever been. Closer than the Cuban Missile Crisis. Closer than the height of the Cold War. Closer than any moment in human history. And if you're watching this thinking, come on, that's just fear-mongering, I get it. I really do. We've heard, the world is ending, so many times that it sounds like background noise now. But here's the thing, in the 1930s, people said the exact same thing. They watched warning sign after warning sign, and they told themselves it would be fine, that the extremists were just blowing off steam, that the system would hold, that somebody else would handle it. 70 million people died in World War II. So today, we're going to do something different. We're going to look at what actually happened in the years before that war, not the stuff you learned in high school, but the real, messy, human decisions that led there. And then we're going to look at right now, January 2026, and we're going to be honest about what we see. But, and this is important, we're not going to stop there. Because history also teaches us something else, catastrophe isn't inevitable. We've prevented it before, we can prevent it again. The question is whether we will. I'm going to need about 30 minutes of your time, and I promise you, by the end, you'll understand not just what's happening in the world, but what you, personally, can do about it. Let's start with a story about a guy named Franz. Music transition, part 1. How it happened before the guy who thought he could control Hitler. Franz von Papen was a German politician in 1932. Smart guy, well-connected, part of the old establishment. And he had what he thought was a brilliant idea. See, there was this loud, angry politician named Adolf Hitler who was getting really popular with working-class Germans. The establishment didn't like Hitler, they thought he was crude, extreme, dangerous. But he had something they wanted, millions of passionate supporters. So Franz made a deal. He convinced the German president to make Hitler the chancellor, basically the prime minister. Franz figured he and his conservative friends would be the real power behind the throne. They'd use Hitler's popularity, then push him aside once things calmed down. Here's what Franz said at the time, and I want you to really hear this. We've hired him. In 2 months, we'll have pushed him so far into a corner that he'll squeal. 2 months later, Franz was unemployed. Within a year, people like him were being arrested, exiled, or murdered. The pattern of establishment figures thinking they can use extremists without getting burned? It's one of the oldest stories in politics. And it almost never works. But Hitler didn't come out of nowhere. He needed something else first. He needed people who were desperate enough to listen. When the economy breaks, people break with it. Let me give you a number, 30%. That was the unemployment rate in Germany in 1932. 30%. 1 in 3 people who wanted to work couldn't find a job. Now, think about what that means. Not just for those people, but for everyone. Your neighbor loses their job. Then your brother. Then you. The money you saved up becomes worthless. The future you planned for evaporates. And here's the thing about humans. When we're scared and desperate, we want answers. We want someone to tell us why this is happening and who's responsible. Hitler gave them answers. Simple answers. You're suffering because of the Treaty of Versailles. Because of the Jews. Because of the socialists. Because Germany was stabbed in the back. Were those answers true? No. But they felt true. And when you're standing in a bread line wondering how you're going to feed your kids, feeling true is often enough. The Nazi Party got 2.6% of the vote in 1928, when the economy was okay. By 1932, at the height of the Depression, they got 37%. Economic pain doesn't automatically create fascism, but it creates the conditions where fascism can grow. It's like dry brush in a forest. You still need someone to light the match, but without the dry brush, the fire can't spread. The missed chances. Okay, so here's where it gets really frustrating. Because World War II wasn't inevitable. There were multiple moments, multiple clear chances, where different choices could have stopped it. The biggest one was March 1936. Hitler ordered German troops to march into the Rhineland, a part of Germany that was supposed to stay demilitarized under the treaty that ended World War I. It was a huge gamble. Germany's army was tiny and weak. France's army was enormous. Hitler later admitted it was the most nerve-wracking time of his early rule. His generals thought it was insane. They had orders to retreat immediately if France pushed back. France had 1.5 million soldiers. Hitler sent in maybe 35,000. And France did nothing. Britain called it Germany, walking into their own backyard. Everyone told themselves it wasn't worth fighting over. But here's what happened next. Hitler learned that the democracies wouldn't fight. So he kept pushing. Austria in 1938. Czechoslovakia in 1938. Each time, the response was the same: strongly worded letters, concerned statements, and ultimately, nothing. The cost of stopping Hitler went up every single year. In 1936, it would have been a police action. By 1939, it was a world war. This is maybe the most important lesson from the 1930s. The longer you wait to confront aggression, the more expensive it becomes. The League of Nations, when international institutions fail. You've probably heard of the United Nations, but before that, there was something called the League of Nations. It was created after World War I with a beautiful idea: countries would work together, and if anyone started a war, everyone else would stop them. Sounds great, right? Here's what actually happened. 1931. Japan invades Manchuria, a part of China. The League investigates. A year later, they vote 42-1 that Japan should withdraw. Japan's response? They quit the League and kept Manchuria. 1935. Italy invades Ethiopia. The League passes sanctions, but they don't cut off oil, the one thing that would actually matter. And they keep the Suez Canal open so Italian ships can pass through. Winston Churchill later said the League didn't fail because its ideas were wrong. It failed because the countries in it deserted those principles. Sound familiar? Because right now, the UN Security Council is basically paralyzed. Russia vetoes anything about Ukraine. China vetoes anything about Taiwan. The United States vetoes anything about Israel. The whole system was designed for a world where the great powers agreed on basic rules. When they don't, it grinds to a halt. The propaganda machine, one more piece of the 1930s puzzle. Joseph Goebbels. Goebbels was Hitler's propaganda minister, and he was terrifyingly good at his job. He wrote down his techniques, and they're chilling to read today. Avoid abstract ideas. Appeal to emotions. Constantly repeat just a few messages. Pick out one special enemy for vilification. Never admit a fault or wrong. By 1933, Goebbels controlled every radio station, newspaper, and movie theater in Germany. There was no alternative information, no way to fact-check. Just one message, repeated over and over, until it felt like the only truth. Now, you might be thinking, well, that can't happen today. We have the internet, we have access to everything. And you're right, that's different. But different isn't necessarily better. We'll come back to that. Part 2. Where We Are Right. NOW, January 2026. Okay, deep breath. Let's talk about today. I'm going to walk you through 4 major situations happening in the world right now. And then we're going to look at what's happening inside democracies, including our own. I'm not going to tell you the sky is falling. But I'm also not going to pretend everything's fine. Because it's not. # Russia and Ukraine. Day 1415 as of this week. The war in Ukraine has been going on for nearly 4 years. Russia controls about 20% of Ukraine's territory, roughly the size of Pennsylvania. In 2025 alone, Russia captured more ground than the previous 2 years combined. But here's what keeps security experts up at night: the nuclear dimension. Russia just launched something called the Oreshnik missile, a new medium-range ballistic missile that can carry nuclear warheads. They fired it conventionally this time. But the fact that they're testing these weapons in combat sends a message. Meanwhile, the main nuclear arms treaty between the US and Russia, called New START, expires next month. And right now, there's no replacement. No negotiations. Nothing. For 45 years during the Cold War, even when the US and Soviet Union hated each other, they kept talking about nuclear weapons. They built guardrails. They created verification systems. They made sure both sides knew the rules. Those guardrails are coming off. # the Middle East. Everything everywhere all at once. If you've tried to follow the Middle East lately, you know it's complicated. So let me simplify. There's a ceasefire in Gaza. It's fragile. Since it started, hundreds of people have still been killed. The underlying issues: what happens to Gaza, who governs it, what happens to the hostages, what happens to Palestinian statehood, none of that is resolved. In Lebanon, Hezbollah and Israel have a ceasefire too. Also fragile. Israel says Hezbollah is rebuilding. Hezbollah still has tens of thousands of rockets. And then there's Iran. Iran's economy is collapsing. Their currency has lost most of its value. There are protests in all 31 provinces. The government is under more pressure than at any time since 1979. Last week, Iran's Defense Council announced they could preemptively respond if they sense a threat. Now, you might think, a weak, unstable Iran is good for us, right? Not necessarily. Regimes under pressure sometimes lash out. They do desperate things. The most dangerous moment isn't when an adversary is strong and confident, it's when they're cornered and scared. Taiwan, the trillion-dollar question. In late December, China ran military exercises around Taiwan. Dozens of fighter jets, Navy ships, Coast Guard vessels. They simulated a blockade of the entire island. And for the first time since 2022, they fired live ammunition into the Taiwan Strait. Taiwan is a democracy of 24 million people. It makes the vast majority of the world's advanced computer chips. If China took control of Taiwan, or even just blockaded it, it would crash the global economy overnight. Taiwan's president called 2026 a crucial year. Defense analysts say the window between now and 2030 is the highest risk period. Nobody knows if China will actually invade. But here's what we do know: they're practicing. A lot. America's internal fractures. Now let's talk about us. Here's a poll number that should stop you cold. 40% of Americans now believe a civil war is likely in the next decade. 40%. Now, is an actual civil war, with armies and battle lines, going to happen? Almost certainly not. We don't have the conditions for that. No regional military forces, no secessionist movements with real power, no economic collapse. But here's what is happening: political violence is at its highest level since the 1970s. There were about 150 politically motivated attacks in the first half of 2025 alone, nearly double the year before. Trust in the federal government is at 22%. It was 77% in the 1960s. We're not looking at civil war. We're looking at something experts call chronic instability, low-level violence, constant tension, an inability to solve problems together. And here's why that matters for everything else we've talked about: a divided America can't lead. We can't rally allies. We can't deter adversaries. We can't make the long-term commitments that kept the peace for 50 years. Our enemies know this, and they're counting on it. # the propaganda problem. Goebbels on steroids. Remember Joseph Goebbels? His whole operation was one radio network and some newspapers. Today, there are 500,000 deepfake videos floating around social media. AI can generate fake news, fake images, fake audio at industrial scale. And unlike Goebbels, modern propaganda doesn't even need a central operator, it spreads itself. Here's the scary part. Research shows that when just 15% of people in a network believe fake news, it distorts the entire system. It's like a little bit of poison in the water supply. And we're all in this water supply. Left, right, center, everyone is swimming in information that's been manipulated, amplified, and targeted based on what makes us angry and scared. Goebbels could only dream of this. Part 3. What we can actually do, the good news you weren't expecting. Okay, I know that was heavy. Take a breath, because here's the part we don't talk about enough. We've prevented catastrophe before. The Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. Nuclear war was, according to President Kennedy's own estimate, a 1 in 3 chance. Soviet missiles in Cuba, American missiles in Turkey, 2 superpowers pointing guns at each other's heads. And we got through it. Not through luck, through choices. Kennedy rejected his military advisors who wanted to bomb Cuba immediately. He kept back-channel communications open with Khrushchev. He gave the Soviets a face-saving way out, secretly agreeing to remove US missiles from Turkey. The lesson? When everyone is telling you to escalate, sometimes the bravest thing is to find another way. After the Cuban crisis, the US and Soviet Union built systems to prevent it from happening again. The hotline between Washington and Moscow, arms control treaties, verification agreements, rules of the road. For 45 years, despite intense hatred and competition, the 2 nuclear superpowers never fired a shot at each other. That wasn't inevitable. It was built, on purpose, by people who decided that survival was more important than winning. # What countries can do. Let me give you a framework. When we look at every time catastrophe was prevented, these same patterns show up. First, keep talking, even, especially, to your enemies. The hotline between Washington and Moscow existed so that misunderstandings wouldn't become nuclear wars. Right now, communication channels between major powers are fraying. That needs to stop. Second, accept mutual constraints. Here's a truth that's hard for Americans to swallow. Sometimes we have to limit ourselves to get our adversaries to limit themselves. Every arms control treaty works this way. I won't do X if you won't do Y. It's not weakness, it's survival. Third, give people a way out. When you back someone into a corner with no escape, they fight. This is true of individuals, and it's true of nations. Kennedy gave Khrushchev an exit. It might have saved the world. Fourth, don't wait. The Rhineland, 1936. The cost of stopping Hitler was tiny. By 1939, it was catastrophic. The earlier you address a problem, the cheaper it is. What about me? Okay, but what can you do? You're not the president. You don't have a hotline to Beijing. Here's the thing. Democracies are bottom-up. Leaders respond to citizens. What you do, what you say, who you support, it adds up. It's slow, but it's real. First, don't become the propaganda. Every time you share that outrageous story without checking it, you're doing Goebbels' job for him. Every time you describe your fellow Americans as enemies to be destroyed, you're weakening the country that our adversaries are counting on collapsing. This doesn't mean, don't be political. It means be smart about it. Check sources. Assume the most inflammatory version of any story is probably wrong. And remember that the person on the other side of the political divide is still your neighbor. Second, support institutions, even imperfect ones. Courts, election systems, a free press. These things are boring until they're gone. The people trying to destroy democracy always go after institutions first. Don't let them. Third, talk to people who disagree with you. Not to fight, not to convert them, just to understand. The Franco-German reconciliation, 2 countries that fought 3 wars in 75 years becoming allies, started with ordinary people talking to each other. Students, business people, citizens who decided they didn't want to keep killing each other. Fourth, Stay informed without doom scrolling. There's a difference between understanding the world and making yourself miserable. You can be aware of what's happening without refreshing Twitter every 5 minutes. The news cycle rewards panic. Don't play that game. Fifth, engage in your community. The strongest societies are the ones where people know their neighbors, where they work together on local problems, where they have something in common besides politics. That's the foundation that everything else rests on. The speech Kennedy never gave, until he did. I want to tell you about a speech. In June 1963, less than a year after the Cuban Missile Crisis, President Kennedy went to American University and said something that, at the time, was borderline radical. He talked about the Soviet Union, and instead of the usual stuff about how evil they were, he said this: "In the final analysis, our most basic common link is that we all inhabit this small planet. We all breathe the same air. We all cherish our children's futures. And we are all mortal." He was asking Americans to see their enemy as human. Not because the Soviets were good, they weren't, but because you can't build peace with people you've decided aren't people. That speech led to the first nuclear test ban treaty. It was the beginning of decades of arms control that may have saved billions of lives. It started with words, with a choice to see things differently. We started with a clock. 89 seconds to midnight, the closest we've ever been. But here's what I want you to take away: that clock isn't a prediction. It's a warning, and warnings exist to be heeded. Every person who studies the 1930s, and I mean every serious historian, says the same thing: it didn't have to happen. There were off-ramps, moments where different choices would have changed everything. The people alive then just didn't take them. We don't get to know how our story ends, but we do get to choose what we do next. The world is dangerous right now. That's true, but the world has been dangerous before, and humans have found ways through. Not through luck, through choices, through courage, through the hard, unglamorous work of building systems that keep the peace. That's what's being asked of us now. Not to panic, not to give up, not to pretend everything's fine. Just to pay attention, to do our part, to remember that the future isn't written yet. 89 seconds is not a lot of time, but it's enough. It has to be enough. *End of episode **** script prepared January 12, 2026.